And we're back. Another great lesson time. Chapter 3, still going strong. Ecology. Oh, yeah. Threats to biodiversity. Not a. All of these things talking about ecology, and we're talking about decline of natural ecosystems and all of the natural world kind of falling apart. Probably not the best material in times like now. So please don't try not to think about it too much. Just in the sense that thing just because it seems like it seems very bad. You don't have to let it keep you up at night and stuff. So if you're having some trouble with it, because I know that there's a lot going on, don't be afraid to just send me an email or whatever, and we can make some accommodations. My inbox is going to be flooded now with everyone saying, "Oh, I don't want to do it," but hopefully, you guys are good, so you'll be honest with it. But lots of bad stuff, I realize. However, good to know because find solutions. That's what we're trying to do here. So keep up with the key terms as we go through, because there's going to be a lot in this one. What was it? Threats to biodiversity. We talked about biodiversity in the last lesson, 2 lessons. Biodiversity, if you don't have it in front of you, what does biodiversity mean? Okay, pause the video. Okay, good. You just basically a bunch of different organisms in a particular region, right? So it's the number of organisms and the variety of organisms is biodiversity. So what can threaten those things? We have some pretty good ideas, but let's get specific. Habitat loss is one of those things. Majority of modern history, human actions proceeded without much thought towards sustainable ecosystems. These actions include draining wetlands, cutting down trees, damming rivers, all threatened within a community ecosystem. So habitat loss. Destruction of habitats from natural disaster, like volcanic eruptions, wildfires, droughts, hurricanes, or human activities, with the example of deforestation. When they lose their habitat, no alternative is available, species may not survive, and biodiversity will be threatened. A habitat is like a home. I don't think we've explicitly defined the term habitat. You might have heard of the company Habitat for Humanity, which makes homes, goes around, I think the world, US, anyways, they build homes, maybe for people that have been displaced or don't have them. So a habitat just means home, place to live. For example, the habitat of a bird nest, it's habitat, right? So if you cut down trees, then birds can't make nests in them. Their habitat is gone. Now let's talk about deforestation. We mentioned the term briefly, but we're going to go into more detail here. So deforestation is clearing forest for human use and not replanting. Now, human use, that can include lumber. Maybe we're cutting down these trees to use for lumber. Maybe we're cutting down these trees to build buildings, to build stuff, infrastructure. Or maybe we're cutting down these forests for meat production so that livestock, like cows, have a place so that they can graze. Cows don't live in forests, so if you want to raise a lot of cows, you have to cut down lots of forest. This is happening primarily in the Amazon rainforest. There was a big conservation effort for the rainforest, for deforestation to stop, for clear cutting of parts of the rainforest in South America to stop earlier in this century, the previous century, but just a couple decades ago, in the 90s, 80s and 90s, I think, maybe even 70s. And a lot of deforestation was slowed in the Amazon. However, recently that has been overturned. And so we're seeing that get cut down. And a big part of that is for the production of meat. Not just for South America, but for North America also. We rely a lot on foreign meat there because we have such a large dependence on red meat. So large sections get cut down for timber or cleared for agriculture. Like I said, Canada has boreal plains ecosystem, which is home to a vast number of bird species. From 66 to 94, 55% decrease in forest resulting in the decline in bird species from 105 to 67. Pretty substantial, right? Half of the bird species were gone because of deforestation. So that's just one example of how it can impact. We see how much forest it was lost in this little graph down here. So 1990 to 2005. Excuse me. We see that country is listed on the left on the y-axis, and then on the x down here is the percent. So going from 0% to 50. We see that, and then color-coded for the continent. Now, Oceania, I think that so we have Southeast Asia. Oceania probably refers to Australia, and down in that region, I don't know specifically where they're including, but Southeast Asia and Oceania are very close. If you look at like a map, Indonesia is sort of in between there. Indonesia, I think, is classified as Oceania, not Southeast Asia. But if you go sort of further up Indonesia, you get close to Thailand, Cambodia, and obviously like India and stuff. And we refer to those areas as Southeast Asia, right? You could probably lump India in there, but I think really it's places like Vietnam, Thailand, and places down there. There's a place I can't think of, but down in that part of the world, and color-coded to show you what continents they are. So the individual country ended here, and if it's pink, it's part of Africa. So lots of clear-cutting in Africa, as well as Honduras, Central America, Nigeria, again Africa, the Philippines, down in Southeast Asia. Oh, I could just look at green, yeah, the Solomon Islands, Oceania. So these are down near Australia. And Central and South America. Surprising that's not more South American countries on here, specifically because of the rainforest. There's a whole bunch of rainforest in South America, with a large part of the rainforest, the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, the country of Brazil. All right, draining wetlands is another thing that can threaten biodiversity. So wetlands are areas of land covered by water. Coots Paradise is a wetland that's probably closest to us right now. Wetlands are important ecosystems for many different plant and animal species. Besides providing habitat for many organisms, wetlands plants filter sediment and pollution from water. It's a big one right there. Wetlands are drained for farming or for building development. Up to 90% of wetlands along Lake Ontario have been destroyed. So that's a huge number, right? Southern Ontario has lots of wetlands because of the region that we're in being surrounded by so many by the Great Lakes. We see lots of wetland territory sort of around this area, and even up into Northern Ontario too, because there's lots of lakes before we get onto the Canadian Shield. So wetlands are a very important thing, and specifically for that, the filter from water. The wetlands are sort of like a bridge in between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. So a wetland is not quite an aquatic, but it's not quite terrestrial. There's sort of a combined sense there, and the benefits to both terrestrial, so like just the land near a lake, and then Lake Ontario, the aquatic. In between there, mediating in between there is it would be like wetlands, like again, like Coots Paradise, which is a great place for frogs, turtles, salamanders, things, organisms like that. And obviously frogs are a great way to control insect populations, right? And we're seeing that frogs are actually very susceptible to pollution or changes in these ecosystems because their skin is so thin that they can absorb lots of toxins. So what we're noticing is lots of frog species the number of frog species are declining also throughout the world because they are so sensitive to pollution or changes in these areas. That's not a good thing because frogs can eat lots of insects, right? Without all these frogs to control the insect population, then we'd have just a bunch of bugs, and that would be super gross. So obviously very important for that. But yeah, wetlands are a very interesting ecosystem. Okay, alien and invasive species. This is a very important slide So put a little star next to it or focus a bit more attention. This is going to be an important one. An alien species is a species accidentally or deliberately introduced into a new location. Alien species may be released on purpose, but typically arrive by accident, maybe shipment of food or other goods. Shipment around the world accidentally brings these species somewhere they're not supposed to be. Most alien species are harmless, and they can also be beneficial. But then there's this term called invasive species, a species that can take over the habitat of what are called native species. And then, all right, so let's just finish these points so we can go in general. Native species are the natural inhabitants of the ecosystem, right? So that's what that term native means. Maybe not the best term, but from the scientific perspective, we would use that term native. There's more of a anthropological use of that term for indigenous people. For humans, anthropological just means relating to humans. So generally, you can refer to humans as native. For example, the First Nations people that live in Canada, right? We say that they were the native population because they were the humans that were living in North America before European settlers came, right? So that helps, that native term. And in this context, in this ecological, biological context, it's okay to use that term native, but not all people appreciate that term native. So I think that just good to know the person that you're talking to, I think, before you use maybe that term. But ultimately, like it's fine to use, and I think many people are comfortable with it, but some people might not be. So we're using this term native to talk about the species that are already there, and we're using this term alien or invasive to talk about a species that is arriving from somewhere else. So the term alien, when you think about, we're not talking about like literally something from another planet, because, well, A, we don't know of life on other planets, so we wouldn't have a science term about it, right? That's like fiction. It's not real to us at this point. And you might have also heard this term, again, applied to humans with maybe illegal aliens, perhaps, right? If you're a fan of the Men in Black movies, that they obviously, they're playing on the dual term for alien, how we use it in like science fiction to say like something from another planet. But we can also use it to refer to people, right? Like, oh, they're an illegal alien. And I don't know why I use the term illegal. You can be an alien, but I just think that illegal alien is probably the more common. Oh my gosh, we're talking about all these weird, sensitive topics. But the reason that term alien just means like not from there, right? So in the science fiction, when like independent, I don't know any modern alien movies. I can only think of these old movies, like Independence Day or something like that. Like, oh no, a spaceship, another species has come to Earth, but they are not from Earth, so we're going to call them aliens, right? The illegal alien thing is like, oh, you're in my country illegally, you're not from here originally. You know what I mean? Like, that's what it's referring to. So there's lots of like kind of problematic usage of a lot of some of these words, because when you apply them to humans, it's like, oh, you're not from here, but who's from wherever, you know? So I luckily don't have to teach that, but there's a lot of similarities, so that's why I think I'm talking about it so much. I could just edit this out, but I might just keep going with it, to be honest. So that's why we use this term alien, a species that's not from that particular area, right? So alien. And the alien species doesn't have to be a bad thing. It could be neutral, good, or bad. And we're going to look at the bad specifically, and we're going to call those invasive species. So it's a species that comes from somewhere else, right? So there's a ship that goes to China, right? Gets some cargo on it, sails back to Canada, right? As they're unloading this cargo, what they don't realize is that there was like a mussel or some sort of aquatic organism that is stuck to the hull of the ship, that was living in China and now is in Canadian waters. We refer to that as an alien species, right? It's like a mussel from somewhere else that is now here. And then all of a sudden, this organism is in a new ecosystem and starts reproducing and starts, eating, looking for food, doing all these things. So it's it's an organism that has been accidentally brought in somewhere new. And an invasive species is a species that can negatively impact the ecosystem that it arrives in. Okay, 2 examples. I'm using this mussel because this is a very real one, right? So the zebra mussels, what happened a couple of decades ago, there was a huge outbreak of zebra mussels in the St. Lawrence River, so that's like Ontario, Quebec, because of ships, because of transporting goods, and the ships that were used to do that brought these zebra mussels from elsewhere. I think that originally from Eastern Europe, like kind of like nearish to Russia, Caspian Sea, and they get brought to this new ecosystem. So native to Asia. I think sort of like northern Asia, like kind of like Russia-ish, or somewhere like Georgia and the Caucasus, somewhere there. So they're freshwater and they're mollusks. They're introduced in the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River through what's called ballast water. That's just what ships use to change their like kind of buoyancy, right? The ships will take in a bunch of water just to change their level when they're in deep waters, and then when they get to shallow waters, they will release a lot of this water. But the issue is they're taking in water in one location, they sail to another location and release that foreign water that can have all these species in there, right? And so alien species, and specifically these two, zebra mussels and the round goby, are invasive because what they do is they out-compete, right? And that's an important word here, right? Native mussels and crustaceans in the lakes for food. The invasive species don't have any natural predators in that area, right? It's basically like they've moved to a new neighborhood, nobody knows them, so they just do whatever they want, and they throw off the delicate balance that's in there, but then nothing can stop it because nothing eats them, right? So if nothing eats these mussels, what's going to happen? They're just going to grow indefinitely. And if they grow indefinitely, they're taking resources away from the native species that were relying on them. And the zebra mussels don't really care. They're not mean. They're not like evil, but that's just how they live, and like that's what living things do. And so they outcompete the native species, and then that can be an issue. Now, that happens all the time. Like when you think about it, organisms move around all the time, and that's how certain native species probably could have originally started as an invasive species of some kind, but they disrupt the ecosystem balance, and we can see like collapses of ecosystems as well. That matters to us humans because we rely on those ecosystems for economy or food or whatever, right? Or even for leisure. So if you notice that all these zebra mussels are showing up, which happened in like the St. Lawrence River and in the Great Lakes, all of these zebra mussels are everywhere. Zebra mussels, their shells are very, very sharp. And so the issue is that if you wanted to go swimming at your cottage on the lake, if all these zebra mussels are there, you can't walk anywhere because they grow on rocks, and it makes it, and they're very sharp, so they're very difficult to walk on. They can cut your feet. So that was a big issue for people who wanted to use the lakes for fun. That's a kind of a small example, but just sort of showing how it changes the way of life of a particular place. And so that's why we have to be very careful with these invasive species. So the zebra mussels, I'm not too sure what the outcome was, but I believe that they're not as much of an issue now. I think that we might have had some things in effect to try and stop the spread of these zebra mussels. The round goby is another example. It's a fish, an Asian fish that arrived again in ballast water and have been around Lake Erie shipwrecks. They compete with native fish for spawning areas and are known to eat the eggs of native fish. So again, not very good for the native fish. So hopefully you get an idea of how these organisms can impact these areas. Another threat to biodiversity is overexploitation, which is the use or extraction of a resource until the resource is depleted. So overusing stuff, right? So overexploitation, right? Overusing. It can lead to dangerously low population numbers, if not the complete disappearance, right? So if you use too much of a resource, you can cause extinction in organisms near it. Overfishing of yellowfin yellowfin tuna maybe, and Atlantic cod during the past few decades, the populations were reduced by 90%, right? In the Atlantic fishing industry, this was a pretty bad hit for the maritime provinces in Canada because their economy is so focused on the fishing industry, but humans are notoriously bad at overfishing. And this overexploitation is if I catch too many fish, then I'm taking all these fish out of the ocean, but if they haven't had a chance to reproduce or replenish their numbers, right? So if I'm constantly fishing, there's no more fish to lay eggs and to make more fish. So what we're going to see is we're going to see the populations go down, right? So this was quite bad for Atlantic Canada and their economy. A lot of people, I think, lost jobs and it wasn't very good economically for them. So there's an issue, right? Because on the one hand, we need to be sustainable, but on the other, we rely on a lot of these industries for food, right? We all have tuna. Now, to be fair, the tuna that we buy in the store, I think very little of it comes from Canada. Mostly, it comes from Southeast Asia, Oceania, and places down there. But we would probably export a lot of our fish elsewhere. But we have to be careful. So fish is just one example, but it applies to any resource, right? That could also be fossil fuels, for example, right? Okay, life cycle of a salmon. We don't have to go too much detail on this. We see that stream temperate rainforest, they go to the ocean, they spawn, and then trees in the temperate rainforest. I don't really know too much about the life cycle of the salmon. They hatch in freshwater streams in the temperate rainforest. This is like BC, like British Columbia. Salmon spend their life in the Pacific, obtaining nutrients from marine ecosystems. They return to their birthplace to spawn. Bears move salmon into the forest. Nutrients released from the salmon's decaying bodies or absorbed plants in the forest. Oh, I see. Right. So that's just part of the cycle there, because bears usually eat them. Salmon have to go upstream, famously, to spawn to reproduce. And the interesting thing is that you can see actually some salmon, I think, in some of the rivers is probably the wrong word, but like in some of the streams around this area, like Ancaster, Dundas area, I think that you can see salmon in some of the streams even around here, which is pretty interesting. So obviously different types of salmon all over the world, but this one are like Pacific salmon or whatever. So this is probably your British Columbia type thing. Another threat to biodiversity is disrupting connectivity. So 70% of nitrogen in plants, trees, insects, birds, and bears in the temperate rainforest comes from Pacific Ocean via salmon, which is pretty interesting. Those nutrients help to increase the biodiversity of the forest. Salmon have decreased by about 90%, result overfishing or habitat destruction from logging and dam construction. The reduction in salmon population has been associated with a reduction in the carrying capacity and the biodiversity of the temperate rainforest. So you notice that the aquatic ecosystem is affecting the terrestrial one. So we see how an organism living in an aquatic is connected to terrestrial of the temperate rainforest. Okay, let's talk about the term extinction. You probably are familiar with this because you might have learned about this with dinosaurs. Because, spoiler alert, dinosaurs are extinct. What is extinction? Extinction is the death of all the individual species. So if a species is extinct, there are no more, to the best of our knowledge, there's no more of that species on Earth. Like they're all dead, right? So, for example, dinosaurs. There's no dinosaurs walking around anywhere. I'm pretty sure we would know. But this can be a little more tricky if you're talking about like a frog species. Frogs are very small. They're not, you can't just send them like a group text and they all show up. They're hard to find, right? So we basically go looking, like we saw different ways of measuring the biodiversity, canopy fogging, transect sampling, those examples from a few lessons ago. You do that basically to try and count them up, and then if we notice that we can't find any of them, then we can call it extinct, right? Now, extinction occurs when the death rate of species remains higher than the birth rate for a long time. So if more of the organism is dying than are being born, then overall you're going to see that's going to lead to extinction, which can occur sort of fast or slow. We're going to talk about that in a bit more, but most extinctions occur over a long period of time. Because remember, when we're talking about the natural world, we're talking very long time periods. Now, there's biotic or abiotic features of a species ecosystem that can change, that can lead to death rates surpassing birth rates. So in some abiotic things, or like a decline in rainfall for a plant species, or a biotic thing would be arrival of a new insect species who feeds and destroys a plant. So the biotic example is like an invasive species comes in, outcompetes everything, and we can see that the native species can go extinct. Or maybe there's no more rain in a particular region, and we again see a certain plant species not able to reproduce, it starts dying off too fast, and then we see an extinction occur as well. Now there's natural extinction. Now extinction just sort of occurs. Humans are trying to stop, most extinctions of organisms, but natural extinction occurs, right? You think about dinosaurs, humans weren't around then, so it wasn't our fault. There we go, one thing wasn't our fault. And there's been lots and lots of species over time that have gone extinct, right? Early human ancestors have gone extinct, right? Because there's only our current species of human, right? There's no human-like organism out there because those ones are all they all went extinct. Now we have so patterns of extinction is the speed, right? So there's a thing called background extinction, which is extinction that occurs over long periods. As ecosystems change over time, existing species become extinct and new species evolve, right? So that's called background extinction. That's like geological time periods, like super long time, because the planet changes, right? And in a particular region, what an ecosystem could be supported in a particular region at one point in time, but after thousands or millions of years, the climate is going to change, right? Over that long time period, yes. And we're going to see that maybe that ecosystem is no longer sustainable. And so what does that mean? The current organisms in that ecosystem are no longer the best adapted, right? So we see that species will evolve, and the species that can evolve to adapt to their new environment better as the environment changes slowly, those new species are the things that become like native or the current ones, whereas other species that cannot evolve or that will die out, right? Will die off and will become extinct, right? This is the process of what's called natural selection. Natural selection is a force that we humans probably can't control, and it's a natural thing. It's sad when you think about it that organisms are going to go extinct, but this is just the way that the world is, right? That's just the natural world. So that's called background extinction, very slow process there. Or you can have a mass extinction, which is a result of sudden change to Earth's ecosystems, leaving them unsustainable. The example here, the death of the dinosaurs, which I don't think with the meteor, right? Our current sort of hypothesis about why dinosaurs were killed off, why there was such a huge mass extinction, specifically for dinosaurs, was because maybe there was a meteorite that hit at some point. Extinction rate, oh yeah, families per million and million years. So this graph down here shows us millions of years ago. So this is 600 million years ago. And then families per million years, extinction rate, a rough idea. So there's a late, so there's what's called Paleozoic. This is just a time period which spans basically 300 million years, which is crazy. But there's 2 big peaks, right? But then the Permian, Triassic, I forget where I think it's right here. I think in between the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic. I think this is roughly when the asteroid that we're talking about, I think it was around here. I could be wrong, though. Anyways, if an asteroid hits Earth, that's going to be a huge deal, and it causes a mass extinction, which is like a rapid, which means that organisms will start dying very, very fast, right? As opposed to this background extinction that will take a much slower time. Let's look at current extinction rates. So I mentioned that, okay, dinosaurs weren't our fault, but there is a lot of threats to the biodiversity that is our fault. Our fault. That is our fault, humans' fault. Some ecologists estimate that the current rate of extinction is 100 to 1,000 times higher than the normal background rate. It's called biodiversity crisis. That crisis is just the current accelerated rate of extinctions. This crisis is hypothesized to result from human actions. So things like deforestation, which leads to habitat destruction, air and water pollution, can change the biotic-abiotic conditions in ecosystems to the point where organisms can no longer survive within ecosystems, right? So humans can basically make places unlivable for certain animals, and we call that a biodiversity crisis. Great. Another thrilling rendition of this. And thanks for listening. Talk soon.